And hello, everybody. Welcome to Narativ. It's good to have you with us tonight. On last night's show, you heard my analysis arguing that 2024 was beginning to feel a lot like 2016. Narrowing poll numbers, a toss-up in the battleground states, and the same strategies used by the two campaigns in the 2016 campaign. My guest tonight is Carl Allen, the author of the provocative new book, The Polls Weren't Wrong. Allen's book fundamentally challenges how we understand and interpret polls. There's the cover. It's a great cover, I gotta say, Carl, especially that if you're going to make statistics look like art, that image on the front cover of your book it certainly looks very arty.
So, I have a story behind it. We can get into it later if you'd like. There's a good story behind it.
Sure, let's do that. But let me just finish up this set to tell people a little bit more about you. Carl's fresh take on polling really challenges the conventional wisdom and promises to give us a new lens through which to view this election cycle. And that's very important, of course, probably the most consequential election we've had in American history. So let's jump in and see his insights might just change how we think about 2024. The big angst about 2016 versus 2024 is also going to be discussed. But tell me about the artwork while you're here.
So there's a good story behind the cover. The type of chart, I've actually never heard it pronounced. I've only read it. I think it's called a Sankey chart, Sankey. Some researchers out of the UK and the British election study, they presented this data from the 2015 general election, before the election, after the election. And they presented this data in such a way that really demonstrates this seemingly unintuitive concept, but it is objectively true in every single election, that people do change their minds close to the election, and that undecideds do not always split in a predictable manner. That is to say, they don't always split evenly, which is the assumption in the US. They don't always split proportional to the decided voters, which is the assumption in Canada, UK. There are ways that we can analyze data in a more objective fashion without imposing our own biases and assumptions. And as you get into the book, you see why analysis like this is so important, and not imposing our own views of no one changes their mind, undecided, split evenly.
Of course, those are big factors in this race, and they were big factors in 2016. Certainly the undecided voters are what ultimately gave Donald Trump the victory in 2016 over Hillary Clinton. And as I look at the terrain today, it feels to me like we're in the same sort of spot. But I think you're saying something different in your book, because while there are parallels to the two elections, there are differences. What are the parallels and what are the differences?
There are some huge differences between 2016 and 2024, even from 2016 to 2020. When we look at elections, we're looking at small sample size events. In the US, general elections every 4 years, midterms every 2 years. But those events are historical events. 2016 was the most consequential election. 2020 was the most consequential election. And now 2024 is the most consequential election. So by nature of these small sample size events having such a huge impact on our daily lives and on the world, we tend to ascribe to them a ton of meaning. And that's not a bad thing. But as an analyst, or as someone who wants to look at data without imposing so much of our own desires onto them, we have to step back and say, okay, what really happened? 2016, Donald Trump was out of nowhere. He was not even the favorite in the primary. 2016 in recent US history was a huge outlier, because not just because Donald Trump was a weird non-political figure running for president, but because we had a record number of voters stating that they were undecided, and a record number of voters stating that they would vote for a third party. I say record meaning 21st century, going back to 2000. So the 2016 election was an outlier. And when I talk to people who understand even just basic science and basic statistics, they say, okay, outliers should not be treated with such impact, with such power. But because 2016 is so prevalent in everyone's minds, we are tempted to do that. Right. And there's a very good analysis in the book demonstrating 2004, 2008, 2012, what happened with undecided voters and third-party voters. There were very few of them, and they decreased close to the election. 2016 was an outlier. 2020 was a different kind of outlier. 2020 was the COVID election. There were very few third parties and undecideds, but vote by mail was through the roof. A record number of people voted not in person. 2024, how do we account for that? We're looking at a mixture of 2020 and a mixture of 2016. There's a female running for president, which obviously is one of the similarities. The swing states are mostly the same. Not as many people are talking about Florida this year. More people are talking about maybe Georgia. But in general, the states that Kamala Harris needs to win, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, are the same ones that Hillary Clinton needed to win in 2016. So here's the big difference. Here's the overview, big picture. If you only take one thing from my 5-minute monologue here, take this. Hillary Clinton was not polling above 47% in any swing state. Her polling average was not above 47% in any swing state, not one, not Michigan, not Pennsylvania, not Wisconsin, not even like Maine and New Hampshire, which are considered traditionally pretty blue states. Her polling averages were low. The reason analysts misled the public, and one of the reasons that it's so important that we have a discussion about statistical literacy, is these polls were reported as, oh, Hillary Clinton's up by 6 in Wisconsin. Maybe that one's kind of safe. But if you look at the polling averages, she was only at 46 to 47.
All the way through? Like at no point during the campaign did she get close to 50?
Not even close. Her polling averages were bumping at 47 in even her strongest states. The traditional analysis is to say she's up by 6, so that's pretty safe. But remember, the assumption that undecided voters will split equally is a lazy one. Not all undecided voters are equal. And in any given election, not all undecided voters might not be the same person or the same people. So we have to account for this in our analysis. To his credit, while he deserves a lot of flack for some of his analysis, Nate Silver in 2016 basically accounted for this. He said, yes, Trump could still win. There were other forecasters who said, oh no, Hillary's 99% to win. Hillary's 99.9% to win because even if she loses this state, she should still win this state, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very poor analysis. It was this up by 6 analysis. So in my book, without spoiling too much, because I talk about this on social media all the time, mathematically, statistically, and empirically, like even if we look at past elections, this isn't just a theory that I have. This is observable data in past elections. A candidate whose poll average is 49% in any state, even if their lead is only 2 points, being ahead 49 to 47 in terms of win probability is far preferable to being ahead 46 to 40.
So the closer you are to 50, basically, makes the difference.
Closer to 50 is a disproportionate return for win probability. If you want to look at it mathematically, because we know 50% means you can't lose. US elections are a little easier than UK elections, Canadian elections, when you have a lot of third parties moving things around. The analogy that I use in the book is a finish line. We know the finish line. If you get to 50 first, then you win. But depending on third party support, if third party support is 1% versus 5%, that moves the finish line from 50 to 49 to 47.
Right.
So we have to, as analysts, we have to account for where that finish line is, number one. But then also knowing that polls are only giving us a base of support. Polls aren't giving us a prediction of a future outcome. They're giving us a candidate's base of support. We have to understand that a smaller lead isn't always worse than a bigger lead with a smaller number.
Did Donald Trump ever get close to 48 in 2016? He was far off from that too.
Neither in 2016 nor 2020. His polling average in 2016 in most of the swing states were 42 to 43.
So how come he won?
There was a disproportionate number of undecided voters who decided to vote for Trump. That's number one. Number two, 2016, remember the US elections don't typically have more than 2 to 3% third party support. In 2016, we were around 8 to 10%. A lot of those people who, when they were asked in the poll, said, if I had to choose today, I would vote for a third party candidate. A lot of those people, when it came time to actually vote and declare which candidate they're going to vote for, they said, I really want my vote to count. In the UK, they call it strategic voting. You probably have a similar phenomenon in Canada where people might support a third party in the poll, but around election time, once they see how things have played out, they say, okay, I don't love this candidate or this party, but I really don't like that person or that party. So I'm going to vote strategically to make sure my vote counts.
Yeah.
That happened in... Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. Strategically, it makes sense even intuitively. But if your assumption as an analyst is that the people who say they're going to vote third party will not change their minds, that's one of the many reasons the cover of the book is demonstrating this concept. People do change their minds. And that also happened in 2016. The major third party candidate was Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson was running as a libertarian, but he was a former Republican. Among people who said they supported Gary Johnson, if you had to guess who they might vote for if they changed their mind, those third party voters probably aren't going to split evenly between Trump and Clinton. They're probably going to favor the more conservative, or at least conservative major party candidate, Donald Trump. And that's almost exactly what happened. And we have data to support it. That's the crazy thing to me. This isn't just the theory that I had that I said, if it happened this way, then this is what we would expect to see in the data. We have data to support that undecided voters disproportionately 60-30 to 65-25 with a few people going third party. Those undecideds went towards Trump.
Where are the undecided voters today? It seems like it's a much closer race. They're both candidates, at least in the battleground states, are close to 48 or maybe a half a point between them. So there's not as many undecided voters, obviously.
Right.
How many are there, and how do we know which way they're breaking?
Far, far fewer undecided voters this year in various swing states. Depending on whose averages you look at, we're talking 3 to 5% of voters who state that they're undecided. We have data on these undecided voters. We know generally who they are, how they voted in the past, et cetera, what issues are important to them. We also know these voters are overwhelmingly independent, meaning they do not identify as a Democrat or a Republican, and they overwhelmingly lean towards being white. So we have data to build a predictive model. Again, polls are not predictions, but we can use the data from them to build a forecast if we're interested. But we can't just make this blanket assumption that they'll split 50-50. So what we saw when Joe Biden was still the candidate, Joe Biden was only polling in the low 40s. And it was very easy to see, 10% of voters, 12% of voters are undecided. But most of these voters are former Democratic voters who voted for Joe Biden. They state that they'll vote for the Democrat in the Senate campaign, but they really don't want Joe Biden to be the candidate, so they're saying they're undecided. In my forecast, I said those voters probably lean Democratic. When Kamala Harris became the nominee, she very quickly consolidated that support. She very quickly got back to where we might expect the race to be. The thing with where the undecided voters are now, pollsters have 2 general elections to figure out who the likely voters are. In 2016, Trump turned out a lot of voters who had previously not voted. They were not considered reliable or likely voters. Now, 2024, we know who the Trump likely voters are. If you voted for Trump in 2020 and you voted for Trump in 2016, it's fair to say if somebody calls you and asks you who you're going to vote for, and you say you're going to vote for Trump, you're a likely Trump voter. And that is why Trump's numbers are so much higher. And I say so much higher. We're talking the difference between 46 and 48. It's not that drastic. But in our minds, because when Joe Biden was in 2020, when Joe Biden was the nominee, his poll averages were 49, 50. Donald Trump's were 46, 47. Now that it's Kamala Harris, her poll averages are maybe a little bit lower than Joe Biden's were at the end, right before the election, but Donald Trump's are a little bit higher. So it feels very close. I always tell people, I said, if you want someone to tell you that this is going to be a blowout, you're not going to get it from me. I would be shocked, absolutely shocked, if either candidate got more than 53, 54% in any swing state. But that's not to say it's a toss-up just because it's close. We have to understand the fact that Kamala Harris is so much closer to 50 in the various swing states that she needs to win, that even if she's only ahead, if she's only up by 1, that still gives her a disproportionate advantage in terms of probability she reaches 50.
But those are really shrinking. When you look at the swing state advantage that Kamala Harris has right now, it's shrinking every day. So when I look at them, it seems like we've gone from 2 to 3 points advantage that she's had to like a 0.5 in some of these swing states. It doesn't give me a lot of comfort. The second part of it is what you said about the undecided voters. If these people are independents, but white, not independents, but probably leaning more towards the Republican candidate in this case, you'd think?
It could be the case, but remember, we also have data in a lot of these swing states. We have Senate races going on as well.
Yeah.
And then you ask these people who they plan to vote for. They tell you they're undecided in the presidential election. And then you ask them about the Senate race and they say they're going to vote for the Democrat. That tells me that there's probably a lean towards Democrats among these independents. It's very hard to say. And again, we have to look at things probabilistically. We can't say this candidate's going to win or this candidate's going to win. Yeah. But in my forecast, Kamala Harris is a 66% favorite. She's favored to win the various swing states. And even if she doesn't win Wisconsin or she doesn't win Pennsylvania, she's doing pretty well in states like North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. She's doing well enough in those states. If she narrowly loses one of those blue wall states, it's not game over. But if she wins all three of the blue wall states, it is game over. So her position is stronger than a toss-up, stronger than I think most other forecasters are talking right now. But again, a 34 or 1 in 3 chance that Trump wins does not let me sleep well at night. And this is the same thing that happened in 2022, by the way. In 2022, the consensus among forecasters was that Republicans were favored to take back the Senate. And we were all looking at the same data. Pennsylvania was the biggest one, but then there was also Nevada and a few others. And I said, I'm not seeing how Republicans realistically get to 51, 52 Senate seats. I think it's possible, but if I had to put a forecast on it, which I did, I would say it's much more likely the Democrats end up at 50, 51 seats, which is what ended up happening. And so for the past 3 election cycles, 2020, 2022, and 2024, I've started to see my forecasts. I've been doing this since 2016, but I've started to see my forecasts separating, and I'm trying to figure out why, if we're looking at the same data, we're arriving at different conclusions. I figured it out. That's why I wrote a book.
Yeah.
I want people to understand where I'm coming from, how I look at the data, how they can understand the data. Because believe it or not, it's not extremely technical. You don't need a degree in stats to understand poll data. I would say you need a high school education in math and statistics to understand poll data. It's not that complex, but if you use the same poor reasoning that a lot of analysts do, oh, this candidate is up by 6, therefore they're a big favorite, or, oh, she's only up by 2, therefore it's a toss-up, you're going to end up reaching a lot of the same, I think, poor conclusions.
So the things that you figured out are undecided voters matter, and the way they split matters a lot. You also figured out that the closer to 50, you're more likely are to win.
My first real job was I worked in an exercise physiology lab. I worked with athletes, non-athletes. I did lots of tests on them and on myself to give athletes and people who want to train an edge. And so analyzing that data, I have to figure out what mattered and what didn't. So when I got into political data, some few years later, I basically came at it from a scientific view. I didn't read so much of what Nate Silver had written. I didn't read a ton of academic journals. I basically said, if I were to approach this independently, how would I do it? I formed my understanding of it. And then I said, if this is true, if my understanding is true, then the closer a candidate is to 50% in the poll average, the more likely they should be to win, regardless of whether they're up by 2 or up by 6. Mm-hmm. And that not only proved to be true, it proved to be so true, I didn't believe it. When I presented this data to my friends who work in the field, to my friends who don't work in the field, they said, there's no freaking way that you collected all of this data going back to 2004, every U.S. election, presidential, Senate, and governor, and analyzed all of this data. And they were like, I'll be damned. Yeah. I'll be damned. And I analyzed it from both perspectives. I said, okay, if saying how much someone is up by is a good metric, then this is what we would expect to see. If the candidate's poll number is more important, this is what we should expect to see. And there are some awesome charts in the book that I will not send to you because I want people to buy the book to see it for themselves. It is absolutely flooring the discrepancy between 49-47 and 46-40.
We won't show that chart, but we are going to show the charts you did share with me because these are interesting. This is the national poll average by weeks until election. You explain to me what this means.
Beautiful. Yeah. Very important in the book. Third-party voters and undecided voters are not equal. We should treat them equally. But at this point in the book, I'm just demonstrating that 2016 is such a historical outlier. We shouldn't put 2016 in the same frame of mind as we did past elections. And then 2020 followed very closely with 2004, 2008, 2012. 2024 is actually even a little bit lower, not quite an outlier, but it's definitely lower than where we were in 2012 or 2020. If we're going to analyze 2016, we have to treat it like the outlier that it is. We can't put 2016 and 2020 and 2024 in the same bin and analyze them apples to apples, because they're not apples to apples. We're comparing very different variables, and if we're doing good science, if we're doing good analysis, we have to account for those different variables. If I'm doing a study on vertical jump, and all I'm testing is vertical reach, I'm about 6'1". I've worked with people as tall as 6'10" and as short as 5'5". If I don't account for height in that analysis, I've done a very poor job of calculating or approximating vertical jump, because height can cause these weird outliers. And people understand that intuitively. But again, when we're talking about elections, they all feel similar because they're so recent and so prevalent in our minds.
Did you analyze Elon Musk's vertical jump and compared to his height the other day?
I would set the over-under at 12 inches.
Something like that, right? It was not very high. So you're saying don't worry so much, basically. It's not 2016 because the undecideds and the third-party candidates, likely voters, are much, much lower at this stage in the election. 2016
is not 2024. 2016, a lot of voters were expecting a blowout. A lot of people were expecting a blowout because the reports, the analysis was, oh, Hillary's up by 6, she's up by 5, whatever, in all of these various swing states. Now, people have a better understanding, not necessarily just a better understanding, but because the poll numbers are so much closer, they understand that, hey, this election will not be a blowout. We have to turn out, we have to vote, we have to campaign, we have to do everything we can this last 4 weeks if we want to win, because best case scenario, you win by 3 or 4 in these various swing states. And that is a best case scenario.
Still very tight. So noise in polls simulation.
Beautiful.
What is it?
Beautiful. Yeah. In chapter 4. And so this happens every time a new poll comes out.
Yeah.
Every single time a new poll comes out, and as we're speaking right now, my DMs are blowing up. I'm getting a bunch of texts from people. There's a new poll out. What does it mean? Should we worry? Should we love it? Individual polls, by statistical necessity, can only tell us a tiny sliver of a bigger picture. Not because polls aren't important, not because polls aren't good, but because polls are limited. So in this simulation, what I'm showing is a population in which there are exactly 50% of people in it that support this candidate. Instead of saying, given this poll, what can we estimate about the population? I approached it from a scientific perspective. I said, given this population, what would we expect poll data to produce from it? So as you look at the dots on this chart, even a perfectly conducted poll, meaning the only source of error is the margin of error. I define that in the book as an ideal poll. The only source of error is the margin of error itself. Even an ideal poll would produce these dots. And you look at how spread out these dots are. The first one's at 49, the second one's at 48, 51, 48, 52, and you even see a couple outliers in here, 54, 45. Oh my gosh, our candidate's winning by a ton. Oh no, they're losing by a ton. Yeah. Individual polls, by necessity, tell us a tiny, they are blurry snapshots. They are a very brief data point. And even within that brief data point, they're subject to volatility. So this chart demonstrates the importance of not putting too much emphasis or too much weight on any individual poll, whether it's the most recent, whether it's the A+ pollster that got it exactly right. I have to use quotes again. It doesn't matter who's conducting the poll. They are limited in how accurate they can be. This chart gives me, an analyst, a lot of information. If a pollster is consistently releasing data that has the candidate at the same number, that's a red flag, because we know even ideal polls will fluctuate.
Interesting.
So if a pollster is consistently putting out 48, 48, 48, 49, 48, 48, 48, that's a red flag. That's a bigger red flag than a candidate saying 51 today, 47 next week, 50 the next week. That fluctuation frustrates people and it makes them view pollsters with more skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, if they're doing good work, that is far more common than a flat, this is what we observe.
Should we trust these rolling averages that Real True Politics or whoever else does? Should we trust those more than individual polls?
Trust is a strong word.
Yeah.
Polling averages in general are much, much better than any individual poll or any individual polling company. But poll averages are also subject to some, not necessarily manipulation, but subjectivity. I actually introduced this concept in the book. It's never been discussed anywhere else before. The idea that a polling average is also subjective is discomforting to a lot of people. But if we are transparent in our methods and we say, these are the polls informing our average, and this is how much weight that we give each of those polls, that's good. That's good that we can be transparent about which polls count, how much they count for. But who's to say that we shouldn't exclude all pollsters that have never polled before? Let's say all new pollsters are automatically not counted.
Right.
I think that's reasonable. You can make an argument for that, but that's not to say that methodology is better than someone else. The simplest example that I can give for why we have to have standards for poll averaging is if I think the most recent 5 polls is the best way to take a poll average, and you think the most recent 10 polls is the best way to take a poll average, who's to say who's right? Who's to say whose poll averages are more accurate? There's not really a standard. But what's happening now in the US, there's been this influx, there's been this rise of partisan polling, especially among Republican pollsters. In 2022, I called it out before it happened, as it happened, and then after the fact, it became fairly well known, this partisan flooding, which is to say partisan pollsters releasing polls that are favorable for their candidate to manipulate these poll averages to make their candidate look more favorable than maybe they are. There's a strong case that this is happening again in 2024, but we have to, as analysts, we have to be able to account for this. I account for it. Other analysts may not so much, but whether I'm right, whether they're right, we can debate it. But what's not debatable is that there is no objective way to take a poll average. And what I wrote about in the book was almost a forecast of sorts of where I said, if we don't start imposing some sort of transparency standards on poll aggregators, people who collect these polls and take averages, you can make an average say almost anything you want. So when I tell people poll averages are much, much more reliable than any individual polls, someone who respects that analysis, but wants the public to see their favored candidate doing better than maybe they are, they can give a poll average that says, just by including, excluding, or weighting certain polls more than others.
So with this chart here, then, the presidential candidates.
Yeah. One of the earliest analysis that I did leading into the 2016 election, before the Trump-Clinton election, was I looked back at presidential elections, and as my hypothesis at that point was that candidates who poll very close to 49% should almost never lose. And in this case, it was 29 times out of 30 in which a candidate was polling at 49% or above in a swing state. And these are only swing states, by the way. I'm not including states that are technically considered safe. These are all battleground swing states. 29 out of 30 through 2016 in presidential races, the candidate who was polling at 49% or above won. Right. Another interesting point, 29 out of 30 was higher than I expected, but that was what I expected. But if you look at those bars that are on the vote share number, this is votes gained or lost versus poll average. 28 out of 30, even at 49%, which is a very strong number already, almost all of them, 28 out of 30, outperformed their poll average, right? Which is to say they got more than 49%, or they got more than their poll average number was. And that led me down another very interesting, and to this date, and I published it for the first time in the book, interesting way to analyze poll data. And there's this concept that I introduced, masking, compensating errors in poll masking.
Yeah.
This idea of masking, which I actually outline in some slightly technical steps in the book, but not like too technical. But it basically says it is highly unlikely that any candidate will underperform their poll average. The reason is a poll average is a estimated base of support. So even if these poll averages are maybe a little higher than they should be, as in if you had taken a census, the number in the poll average would have actually been a little lower, undecided voters alone will typically mask that difference. So looking at Team Georgia Trump, they're the first one there on the left on that chart, his poll average was just over 49, it looks like. Let's just assume, for sake of argument, that his actual number, his actual support in the population was only 48. There were enough undecided voters to mask that difference. And so the only possible explanation for why candidates almost never underperform their poll average is this concept of masking, which is to say, if we know how many undecided voters there are, we can put a very strong probability on these ranges of outcomes. But if you do this up by 6, up by 2 level analysis, you're not accounting for how many undecideds there are. So not only are you not accounting for how likely it is that a candidate outperforms their poll average, you're not accounting for the possibility that they outperform it by a lot.
Of the 30, by the way, here, you said 29 were reflective of the final result. Is it 2016 that wasn't?
Mitt Romney in Florida in 2012 was the only presidential candidate in modern history to have polled in a swing state 49% or above and lost that state. Interestingly, that was in Florida in 2012. His polling average was and he ended up at 49.1, and Barack Obama won it with 49.8 or something like that. So it was still remarkably close, which the poll averages showed. Both Romney and Obama were very close at that 49 number. So that was far from unexpected, but still, I wanted to show why, not just why candidates who poll 49% or higher tend to win, but also this isn't just a theory. Look, we have tons of data to support it. And by the way, you notice this is only presidential candidates from 2004 to 2016. I expand my analysis to Senate races because those are also statewide, governor's races, which are also statewide. And then obviously, when the book was released, I went through 2022. And I'm not going to give much away. You can guess how that might play out.
You are really passionate about it. It really comes through. And it's making me feel a little bit better, I guess, about what's coming up in 2024. Because
look, I'm very mindful of the fact that a lot of people who follow me are on the same side as me politically, and they want the same outcome. But I tell people there will come a day when the data's not as favorable as I want it to be. Maybe this election, maybe 10 elections from now. God willing, I'm still here until election. But we have to understand that my analysis, and one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book, one of the reasons I post so frequently on social media, is my analysis is consistent. My analysis is consistent. I apply these same understandings to every election. And not ironically, but suitably, in 2022, I live in Ohio, Tim Ryan was polling at 46 to 47% in the poll average. On this data, J.D. Vance, a name many people might know, was polling at 44, 45% in polling averages. My polling averages, 538. Everybody had the same number.
Yeah.
I said, guys, this is Ohio. If you had to guess how those 10% undecided might eventually vote, they're probably going to lean towards J.D. Vance because he's a Republican, and J.D. Vance should be considered the favorite in the election. And J.D. Vance won, and history has played out favorably for him. But I'm not always on the side of this is what I want to happen, so I'm going to impose my will on the data. I always try to step back and look at things from as objective of a view as I can. And that's why I'm so passionate about saying Kamala Harris has a better chance than a toss-up, better than people realize. But I'm also very quick to say, guys, 1 in 3 in baseball is a very good batting average.
Yeah, that's true.
So we have to be careful. Yes, we should feel okay, but that doesn't mean we can just sit back, relax, and not try to sprint through the finish line. So
I don't feel okay, and this is not science, and you don't have to respond to this, but I don't feel okay because I know what the Trump campaign is doing, and they are basically have introduced this flood of disinformation into the zone. And they
Correct.
are targeting her directly with, I counted about 15 lies in the last 3 minutes of Trump's speech in Butler, Pennsylvania the other day. If there's such a lot of lies being put out there, and with the help of Elon Musk's Twitter and all these other disinformation amplifiers that they have from Russia or whomever, there is going to be a lot challenging their perspective and challenging where they should put their votes. And as you point out, they might change their votes all the way to the very last day. Meanwhile, on the Democrat side, if you're going to vote for Kamala, you're going to vote for Kamala. You're there.
Right.
It's the undecideds that are going to be really targeted with all this disinformation. And that to me is terrifying, because at the end of the day, that's where undecideds can change their votes on the very last day. And they have. And the Trump campaign and all his supporters in whatever form they are, from Elon Musk to others, are very good at flooding the zone with disinformation.
Correct. One important piece of information that I've learned in my research, and so when I talk about poll masking and compensating errors and different forms of analysis that I think I've been on the leading edge of, I'm proud of that. Confirmation bias is not one of the things that I have discovered. This has been around for as long as humans have been around. We tend to favor information that we like. And so these Trump rallies where he's spreading this misinformation are mainly targeted at his base. He wants to make sure his base votes. He wants to make sure his base cares about things. He wants to make sure that his base views the other side as a threat to their way of living, so to speak. And to his credit, if I were getting paid more money than they could ever pay me to strategize for Trump, there are a few ways that I would approach things. One is making sure you're getting your base to turn out. Trump's base in 2016 got him to 47%, 48% in these various swing states. Because of third-party voters basically moving that finish line from 50 to 48, Trump was able to win with 48% of the vote. In 2020, fewer third-party voters, Trump could not win with 48, even 49% of the vote. Joe Biden ended up holding on. 2024, we're looking at the same kind of scenario where the winner is going to need to get 50% or close to it in every swing state. And Trump is trying to shore up that 48% that are definitely going to vote for him. And what's going to make the difference is who can get these kind of fringe voters. Maybe they're undecided, or maybe they're a new voter. Maybe they haven't voted before. Who can get them on their side? And to Kamala Harris's credit and her campaign's credit, they are pursuing demographics, both females, women of color, people who maybe are not as strong of historical voters, right? We know people who traditionally vote skew older in the US and they skew conservative. But if they can get these demographics to boost even just 1 or 2% more than they had expected, that makes all of the difference. In 2016, Trump did that with white working class voters, basically people who hadn't voted in a long time, but leaned conservative. He got them to vote. But also, one of the less ethical things that he did, but strategically made sense, is he targeted people who would lean towards voting for Hillary and basically said, don't worry about it. Don't waste your vote. She's bad because of this. You might remember some of the language that was used about predators or things like that. They targeted African-American communities to not get them to turn out and vote for Hillary Clinton. In 2024, we're seeing the same thing play out. I've looked at some of the ads that they're using to target African-American voters, not so much women anymore because they know they can't win among women, but African-American voters specifically. They're basically trying to get them to not vote. They're not trying to change their minds. They're not trying to get them to vote for Trump. They're just trying to say, oh, Kamala Harris won't do what she says she's going to do, so why bother?
Right.
I don't think that's going to be as effective in 2024 as it was in 2016.
I agree with you on that one for sure. And if they're targeting male voters, the Kamala Harris campaign one day yesterday was on Howard Stern, Colbert having a beer, and I don't know what other things. They certainly they know what they're after.
Yeah.
The Polls Weren't Wrong is the name of the book. Carl Allen is the author. And this is great. I love seeing people who are challenging the system, who are bringing new insight into how things are done. And I think you really do it in this book, and you do it in a very thorough, easy to understand way. As you said earlier on, it's stuff that I can understand it, so anyone can understand it. It's very palatable, but also really important. These elections are so vital. And we've all declared them, as you said, each one more consequential than the next. So how you understand these polls and also how the polling industry organizes itself is very crucial. And you cover both of those bases really well. You introduce a bunch of new factors, and it's all very applicable to where we are right now. So everyone should really get out and buy this book, The Polls Weren't Wrong by Carl Allen. It's available practically everywhere you can get books these days, and it's published by Chapman and Hall. So Carl, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. And I really appreciate your insights. You've been terrific. I hope your phone doesn't stop ringing once you get off the interview here, because I know a lot of people are going to want to book you because you've done a terrific job explaining where we are in the elections this year.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Again, no matter what you think the state of the race is right now, no matter how much you like my forecasts, at the end of the day, go vote, get friends to vote, make sure everybody is voting. The election could be decided by 0.1%. So make sure that we're doing everything that we can to turn out and make the election go the way we want it to.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for being on the show tonight, and everyone should buy the book, and we shall see you hopefully again soon on Narativ. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, guys.
One day, you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narativ, where truth lives.